Hello, this is episode number 14 of the Martial Podcast. I'm your host, Mark Jacobs. I'm a martial artist, martial arts journalist, author of the book The Principles of Unarmed Combat, and I tell stories about martial arts. Well, on a recent show, one of our guests, Jody Lynn Reicher, mentioned her coach and had some good things to say about him, which prompted some interest from listeners in hearing from him directly. And he's a good friend who I've been wanting to have on the show anyway, so I've finally managed to get him to sit still for a talk. Phil Dunlap has one of the most unique backgrounds in martial arts of anyone I know. He learned an obscure and brutal form of Burmese martial arts from his grandfather, who lived in what was then called Burma, now Myanmar, before and during World War II. Phil would go over there himself to fight in bare knuckle Burmese boxing and no holds barred matches starting as a teenager. Now, at the age of 61, he is what I believe to be the oldest person competing on the pro grappling circuit, where, for some insane reason, he regularly goes against opponents half his age. Phil, how are you doing?
I'm doing great. Thanks for the warm intro.
So, in martial arts, I'm sure you're familiar with this. You run into people with these ridiculous stories about how they learned martial arts from their father or grandfather or someone who went to a mountaintop in Asia somewhere and came back with this deadly secret martial art that no one else knew and had never heard of. And the story is always bullshit, except for you. In, in, in a lifetime, my whole lifetime of doing this stuff, you're the one person I've ever met who that story is actually true for, right?
Well, you know what's kind of funny is for years now. Remember, Burmese. Everybody kind of knows what Burmese boxing is now.
Hmm.
Lethway, whatever people want to call it.
Yeah,
It's basically a no rules Burmese form of kickboxing.
right.
Okay, but you got to remember, there wasn't the internet. I fought in the late 70s, early 80s. Okay, and the internet wasn't a big thing then. So
Hmm.
you're trying to tell people, yeah, my grandfather taught me this, this obscure martial art that you haven't heard of. Yeah, and I go over to this country that you have no idea where it is, and I fight. Okay, and nobody actually believes that this stuff exists.
Hmm.
Okay, it's kind of like, who fights bear? I headbutts allowed. Okay, then it was kind of like all of a sudden I can remember in the 90s when VHS got big. I started to post on the internet, on YouTube. I started to post Burmese boxing videos. It was like for the first time in my life, people didn't look at me like I was insane.
Yeah. And I'll say I checked out everything that you told. When we first met, I think it was maybe 15 years ago, our mutual friend Vince Giordano introduced us and told me I should write something about you. You had an interesting story. And since Vince is very knowledgeable in Southeast Asian martial arts, I took what he
He's
said
honest.
seriously. Yeah,
In my
yeah.
book, he when it comes to unbiased research,
Hmm.
he's kind of the man, because one of the things I
Yeah,
really love about his products is he never puts himself out front.
yeah,
It's always the art when he shows. Like, I love
right.
his stuff on Indian wrestling,
Yeah.
but I've always said, he like when I need to research something, he's the first call.
Yeah. But even after what he said, after I went out, I interviewed you for a magazine piece, but before I wrote anything, everything you told me that I could factually check, as far as information about Burma, Myanmar, about Lethway, anything you said, I checked because your story was so out there
I
that
know.
and I'm used to people in martial arts BSing all the time, but everything you said that I could check turned out to be factually true. So I figure either what you said was all true or you really went above and beyond to fabricate your story.
Yeah, I'll be honest with you. I'd love to be that creative. Like I always tell people, I'd love to be like, somebody like Bruce Lee, where I said, oh, yeah, I was sitting around one day and I thought of this shit. Nah, I'm
So,
fucking stupid. Okay. It's kind of like, you got to show me stuff to make it work?
so tell people first about your grandfather, how he learned this style of martial arts, which is technically called Kien, right?
Yes, it's a Northern Burmese style, uh, from what's called the Kins. No, I'm sorry, I'm off in space. The Kashin states.
Hmm.
Okay, they actually call it Kachin, but my bad English to Burmese translation or to sing faux translation comes out Cashin. So it's just something me. I do realize that it's Kachin. Okay. It's just I have enough problems with English. Okay. And like I say, the ethnic group it came from was what's called the Chinpaw and to a lesser degree the Naga. They're ethnic groups within the Kachin state. I'll give you the elevator version.
Mhm.
My great grandfather was a doctor, and he treated Irish people that rebelled in Ireland during the Fenian Rebellion. And basically, what happened is he became wanted for treating people that were in uprising against the British nation. He ended up emigrating to China. So my grandfather actually grew up in China. He became an acupuncturist. And I know when he was younger, he trained a lot of plum flower fist kung fu. From my understanding, it's the forerunner of Wing Chun.
Mhm.
But then what happened is he ended up getting in some trouble himself. He migrated to Burma and he ended up settling in the Kachin state. And to make a long story short, prior to World War II, there was a tribal leader and he basically saved his wife and ended up marrying his daughter.
Mhm.
So the idea is, and he was the person that trained in the Kachin arts of Kien, Ganu Kien, and the other various arts, which would be in the Burmese language, it would be Lethwei, Thine, and Naban. But the idea is it's one of those things where he turned out when World War II came, his two brother-in-laws died during the war. So he was kind of the last man standing and it ended up inheriting the system.
Mhm.
Okay. And I'm kind of like the only person my grandfather taught or really showed more than just cursory knowledge to because he wasn't into sharing it. And it was one of those things where I'm kind of last man standing. So I got it. In other words, like I joke around and it's not because, either he nor I were the best. Okay. It's just we were the kind of last man standing in line.
Right. And the training you did with your grandfather was rather on the harsh side, correct? I think you told me he had you learn how to leg kick by going out and kicking a flagpole with your shin every morning.
It was actually a wooden post in the backyard.
Oh,
Now,
okay.
just picture a 9-year-old kid. Now, remember, I am so glad now I did it
Hmm.
because to this day, at 61, I can eat leg kicks like they were lunch. It really doesn't bother me. Okay, my shins don't feel anything, and they're not going to break when I kick somebody. But at the time, just picture like a 9-year-old kid out, 20 minutes each day kicking a flag post with each leg. And he's kind of like sitting there bitching to himself the whole time because he wants to be Bruce Lee. He wants to learn the cool shit.
And
I'm so glad I came up that way
yeah,
instead of the way other people do. Because for me, it was like I always joke around. Like people ask me, where did my love for it come from? Well, it honestly, as an older person, you get very, you look back on life and you start to things come into a much bigger perspective. And I realized that the key to my success in the martial arts was actually, I came from a very, very strange family upbringing. My dad was a criminal and my mom was schizophrenic. So I spent a lot of time being raised by my grandfather. And my grandfather was a very hard man. Remember, he survived World War II in Burma, fought against the Japanese. He was just a hard man. So if I wanted his attention, I had to train. And to me, like I equate my success in martial arts was that quest a kid has for feeling loved. Okay, I got his attention when I trained. So I trained hard. And for me, like I always say, the hardest part of the martial arts for me was learning how to teach. Because when I first started teaching, I was friggin' awful. In other words, it was like, it was kind of like, I got beat the fuck out of, so I'll beat the fuck out of you too. That's how people learn. Okay. And like you take a 28-year-old, it's not like working with a 6-year-old where you're
yeah,
roughing him
yeah.
up and like he's adapting. Okay, no, people get hurt. I found out that you had to grapple with mats on the floor instead of the cement. Cement was very bad for student retention. But for me, it was training was like play. So it was like I never had a class where people are doing things. So structuring a class was very weird for me. So my experience in the martial arts is very counterintuitive to what other people perceive the martial arts. To me, the martial arts had nothing to do about discipline, character. In other words, discipline, the character, and stuff like that all came from the idea of training hard,
Hmm.
being willing to sacrifice to get good. It had nothing to do with this like higher higher calling. In other words, like, I was raised on the principle of to be kind to your opponent is to be cruel to yourself.
Yeah.
You want to render him unable to continue further damage as quickly as humanly possible. And one of the unique things about Burmese arts in general is, to me, I've always thought that they were, in a way, almost ass backwards compared to what we as Americans consider the martial principle. Almost everything in the Burmese arts is overkill. Burmese boxing, 3 knockouts for the win. Let's put it this way: nobody thought about brain damage at the time. That second and third knockout is never a good thing.
Yeah, I guess athletic commission safety regulation was not a big thing for the Burmese back then.
No, like, I had a tooth in my hand one time. What was the treatment? Pair of pliers and some alcohol.
So when you were, what, 15, 16, your grandfather started bringing you over there to
I had
fight
my
professionally.
first, right. I had my first fight at, you still there?
Yep.
Okay, I heard a beep. But my first fight was a little past my 15th birthday. I had just gotten thrown out of high school. I was not, as I said, in other words, this had nothing to do with the higher callings of martial arts. And when you teach a kid to fight, he's going to fight.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I grew up in the Bronx, which was a place you walked one neighborhood over, you were in a fight automatically because you were in an Italian neighborhood. Okay, so it was kind of like it was that upbringing where I fought all the time regularly, much less, fighting competitively. And it was kind of like I was raised to do it. So it was no big thing. And I get a kick out of it. When I tell people in America, I had my first pro fight at 15, you're like, what the fuck? And I'm like, dude, I was a late starter. If I fought a 16, 17-year-old, he'd already had 40 fights.
Yeah, you see some of the Muay Thai fighters, these kids, they start fighting professionally when they're like 9 years old.
What I was watching one the other day, and which I happen to love. I love that mixed format on the cards where they have Thai boxing, kickboxing, grappling, and mixed martial arts. But I was watching one Thai boxing match where the guy had 320 fights. Okay, listen, I got 119, and I feel like I'm ready for the grave. And he was only 40 years old.
Yeah, that takes its toll on you, I would imagine. I don't know what the life expectancy is on the professional Thai boxers, but I'm guessing it's not as long as the average person in Thailand.
I've known a lot of guys that when they get done with the sport. Now, number one, a lot of times you get burnt out and you stop taking care of yourself.
Yeah.
But I know a lot of the guys that felt like, in other words, it's kind of like I've worked out with a couple of quote unquote legends in Muay Thai that were retired that could barely hold pads anymore.
Yeah.
Yeah, their body's just so beat up.
Yeah,
it's a lot of trauma. And I always tell people, like, if you go over to Thailand, they train differently. They're not going to war. When you're doing rounds, they're always working something.
Yeah.
They have an intelligent approach to fighting so that you can fight every couple of weeks. Whereas a lot of guys in American gyms, they just murdering each other.
Yeah, I've noticed that among experienced Thai boxing trainers that you watch the sparring that they'll do in the gym, and it's not what you see in the average American boxing gym, where guys are basically having a fight every time they go in for sparring.
Right, and you're seeing it more in mixed martial arts now. Some of these guys that are a little bit older fighters, like Robbie Lawler, for the sake of argument, Milicic was one of those Shark Tanks where guys got together and they banged the hell out of each other.
Yeah.
Okay, now Robbie Lawler hardly spars before he fights. He's already got all those rounds in the bank. He just needs to work his timing and distancing.
Yeah.
There's getting hit hard isn't going to prepare him anymore. It's just going to be detrimental.
Yeah.
It's like I joke around, like I could never go back to doing striking competitively at 61, but I feel like I can grapple at 70.
Now, when you first started going over there, I think you told me your first fight you fought in a region where they still practiced head hunting.
That wasn't my first. That wasn't my first fight. It was my first trip.
Ah.
Okay. It was in a Wa village.
Right.
Now, if things have really changed, I was watching a special on Hawaii, and it's kind of like they're the richest people in Burma right now, which is kind of crazy because they were back then they were kind of like the bad boys of bad boys. Okay, they actually were former headhunters, or actually current headhunters. They're former headhunters now, but up until the 80s, they still had a headhunting season. And the idea is when you went into a Wa village, a lot of times you saw heads lined up down the path to the village. And the weirdest thing, now remember, you're a 15-year-old kid. You've been brought up on these stories, and it's kind of like, yeah, they sound cool, but they're far-fetched. You're taking them with a grain of sand. You know, your grandfather, he's old. Old people like to tell stories, like, it's this, that, the other thing. But like suddenly you're walking down a path, and like, there's fresh heads half a mile out. Okay, and you're like, fuck, what if I lose, did it kill me? Or if I win, did it kill me? It's kind of like, fuck, what am I doing here? It was like Alice in Wonderland. It really was. I was prepared for it, but the reality of it. And it was one of the things that, like, in the more remote Shinpo villages, like in the long hut, they'd have the head of almost everything they killed because you chop the head off to free the spirit. Okay, so if they killed something for dinner, they fucking kept the head. They cleaned the skull and they kept it. So it was just this surreal thing. But on the one hand, it was the people over there, as simple as it seems. Okay, you're saying headhunters, but they were also some of the most cordial people in the world.
Interesting. And you were fighting primarily Lethwei over there, which for
Primarily Lethwei.
for people who aren't familiar, it's like Muay Thai but done with no gloves, and they allow headbutts. And in the version you did in the Kachin and Wat region, they allowed groin shots as well, right?
Groin shots and you could do a takedown with one continuous strike to the ground,
Right.
for the sake of argument. So if I manage to get a hip toss,
Mhm.
I can land on you with an elbow.
I know in most of the country they had what they call a second chance rule, where if you knock someone out, they get a minute to wake up, and they keep going until the person's knocked out a second time. But where you
That's
fought,
post
that
94.
right, and where you
Oh,
fought, they had the three knockout rule.
right. Prior to 94, okay, the government tried to repackage or start repackaging Burmese boxing as almost like as an export.
Hmm.
They were hoping to almost get into travel tourism and everything like that. So the idea, because it was working for the Thais, you were getting a big tourist industry going over to Thailand and training.
Right.
So the Burmese boxing tried to repackage with the Golden Belt, where they tried to come up with a government-sponsored tournament
Hmm.
basically every year for the Golden Belt.
Right.
And the idea is that's when they went with the single injury timeout.
Hmm.
Okay, and what it was if you got knocked out, you had a minute to continue. Prior to that, if you got knocked out, you had 1 minute to decide to continue, and you could do it basically. You could do it twice, so 3 knockouts would win the fight.
Hmm.
All fights had to win by knockout, and prior to the Golden Belt, the final round was until the fight ended. After the Golden Belt, suddenly you saw fighters, instead of having a let's say a 28-2 record, some of these guys would have a 26-2, an 18 record, 18
Hmm.
draws.
Right. What was that like fighting under rules that you had to knock somebody out three times and it kept going until the person was knocked out?
That was my only experience in training for that type of thing. So
Hmm.
in other words, like what you think of as kickboxing with gloves on, where points are scored, was counterintuitive to me.
Hmm.
Like I didn't understand why anybody, like, in other words, in Lethwei, you don't see a lot of, like, in boxing, jabs are a staple. Control the distance, set things up. But every time you pop that jab out, you're scoring a point. In Burmese boxing, it's not working that way.
Hmm.
So if I'm not hurting you, and Burmese boxing tends to happen, and I always say you see this a lot in combat sports. You see it going on a lot in grappling now, where grappling starts to change as people adapt to rule sets. It was like grappling in a submission only match becomes very different
Yep.
than in a point match. So like I tell people all the time, the rules start to dictate the way the combat sport develops.
Absolutely.
Okay. And since there were no points, Burmese boxing almost tends to be a series of runs. And what I
Hmm.
mean by runs is go in, blitz the guy, take an angle back out, reset, look for an opening, blitz the guy again. Because the
Hmm.
whole purpose is to knock him out
Yeah.
any way you can. So the idea is you're always sitting on your punches. Everything's thrown with power. There's
Hmm.
very little setup. And honestly, like I tell people, if you watch a Burmese boxing match, watch it first at speed and then watch it slow-mo because there's a lot more going on than the average person actually sees.
Hmm.
And that's one of the things when you watch it in slow-mo, it's almost a different fight because then you start to see the hand positioning on the punches. The punching is different than Thai boxing or boxing. Everything's set up just a little bit different.
Yeah. If you look at the boxing, kickboxing stuff you see across Southeast Asia, Thailand, Laos, Cambodia, as well as Myanmar, clearly there was a common origin there, but Lethwei is probably closer to that common origin. Would you say it's different than Muay Thai with the lack of the gloves and the use of headbutts?
I honestly think it's almost as if, let's face it, you go to Burma now, even with the advent of democracy and then they closed it back down. But in other words, it's still like a land time forgotten. And what I look at is it's almost like kickboxing there never took the advancements. Now this can be looked at two ways. In other words, it's in its original pure form, but it hasn't evolved the way Thai boxing did with the introduction of gloves.
Yeah,
Okay, because the gloves change
right.
things. And then for the sake of argument, the point system, look how the Thai boxers adjusted when Westerners came over with a more boxing centric approach.
Yeah.
They started to get better with their hands.
Mhm.
So Burma had never had any of that. It was very interesting for me when some, like for the sake of argument, what's his name? He went over there and fought, not Dave LeDuc. His last name's Washington. I'm forgetting his first name, but he's a Thai boxer with a Thai.
Cyrus Washington, is that who you're saying?
Yes, with a
Yeah,
very,
yeah.
very, very. He's got he's a Thai boxer, but with very Taekwondo. He's got a Taekwondo background also,
Hmm.
but his athleticism was something that it was interesting to watch the Burmese start to adjust to.
Yeah.
And that's one of the things I love about when you do. If you keep it pure, and then you start to introduce the differences in,
Hmm.
but with the idea of keeping the rules the way they are,
Yeah.
I think the sport can update itself. But if you
Yeah.
change the rules to update the sport, I think you ruin the sport.
Well, if we go back about 4 or 5 years ago, Lethwei had its moment when a promotion called, I think it was a WLC, was streaming matches online. I think they even did some fights here in the US and was getting a little popularity around the world, but then Myanmar descended into some political chaos, and now I guess it's pretty much a civil war over there, and that's more or less stopped the growth of Lethwei. Is that right?
It's basically killed it.
Yeah.
And also, I'll be honest with you, I'm not a big fan. Like, I'm a big fan of Lethwei making it out of Burma.
Hmm.
I should probably explain for my own stubborn political reasons. I hate the name Myanmar. I will not use it, okay, because it's almost an insult to the ethnic groups.
Yeah.
So it's one of those things. So when I say that, just remember you're talking to a cranky white guy who just won't say it.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
so it's kind of like one of those things. But like I tell people all the time, I didn't like the rule changes where they decided to make a decision in the WLC.
Hmm.
I don't like decisions in Burmese boxing. I feel like it kind of ruins the dynamic of the fight. But that's what the Western public wanted.
Yeah.
But I'm not a big fan of the revamp that the government did in '94 with the Golden Belt, where they started to change rules to make it more palatable.
Hmm.
I think it would have been palatable as different on its own.
Hmm.
But yeah, I thought it was going great guns, but the government was really driving a lot of the old masters from the ethnic region out of the sport.
Mm.
because they wanted to control the sport.
Yeah.
They wanted to make the sport like, the government wanted to say what Burmese boxing was.
Yeah.
Okay, they started to pick trainers that people could train with. Like if you were a foreigner and wanted to go over, you could train with this guy, but you couldn't train with that guy.
Right. Well, like anywhere else, there's a lot of variety in Burmese martial arts.
Huge.
Some of them are influenced by Chinese martial arts, and you believe a lot of the arts you did had a strong Indian influence, right?
Yes. I would say a very strong Indian influence because I've met a couple Indian martial art practitioners that concepts and theory and reasons for doing something were very similar.
Mhm. And mo most of the Burmese grappling you see probably comes from Chinese or Mongolian wrestling, which is only stand up, no groundwork. But in the
Well,
stuff,
that's as you get between you and I, that would be the Burmese wrestling that most people are familiar with is Rakhine wrestling. They have a big tournament every year, and the now remember all of this is oral history because Burma doesn't have great written history,
right.
but according to and it makes sense. At the time, in early Burmese history, Rakhine were pirates. They
Mhm.
were basically water people. Okay, it was boat wrestling, and when
Mhm.
you look at the way they wrestle, it's all upper body takedowns like Greco,
Mhm.
and the goal is to throw the person and remain standing.
Right.
Okay, so the idea is it does make sense in the context of how it was explained to me that the wrestling they do is
Right.
based on the idea once I throw you off the boat, the fight's over.
Right. Well, I think also I've read that the Burman ethnic group, which I guess is the majority group over there, that they come from a region near Tibet where there was Mongolian grappling, which is basically again just standing throws, no ground wrestling. So my understanding is that you believe your style came from India because it does have a lot of groundwork in it.
Yes, India, and I've run into a couple people from Nagaland that did a grappling style with submissions that struck me as
Right.
reasonably similar.
Right. And the Naga is an ethnic group that comes from India as well, right?
Right, right, right.
Yeah. And what one of the other unique things about the art you did was that it included biting within the grappling. I think you've told me that's because the region had a history of cannibalism, so there was less of a cultural taboo on biting human flesh.
Well, in other words, between you and I shouldn't say between you and I'm on a freaking podcast. Anybody who wants to listen can hear this. Okay, so that's just one of those pauses I do when I reset my brain. But it's kind of funny because I always told people, okay, remember, you're talking people who are animists. Okay, first thing they're going to do when they go to battle is they cut the head off their enemy through the spirit. They don't want to be haunted. If the spirit can't leave the body, it haunts the earth and follows you around and curses you. So you chop the head off, free the spirit. Generally, you eat the heart to get their power. They also had a tendency when they went to war. They weren't cannibals in the form of, oh yeah, let's go get us some human for dinner.
Hmm.
When they went to war, they lived off the enemy.
Hmm.
Okay, I always told people in a jungle, you need salt and you need protein. The human body has both.
Yeah.
Okay, so it's a natural segue in a period like that. So it wasn't a big leap for them to bite an ear off, bite a nose off, and it was understood in all the combat sports that you needed to protect against that. And one of the reasons I always said the overkill aspect of the sport, submission grappling with open palm strikes, kickboxing, 3 knockouts wins the fight. What are
Hmm.
you really training for? You're training for the toughness needed in battle.
Yeah.
You're training for you don't stop until it's fucking over. So that was always the combat sport, never really with them became like even with Sambo. Sambo was originally started as a military
Hmm.
art. Okay, yet it became a sport unto itself. Whereas Burmese boxing was always, we're prepared. Like the idea was like, yeah, the fight's important,
Hmm.
but I'm ready to go.
Well, that's kind of the progression that all martial arts eventually go through. Maybe it's coming later to Lethway, but with all the changes now, it's coming to that as well, that things progress from combative arts, warfare arts, defensive arts to sports. You saw it in fencing, in fist fighting, turning into boxing. That just seems to be the natural progression of all human combative endeavors, no?
Yes, I actually happen to agree with that because I see myself doing it with like, okay, now I'm in the United States. I'm somebody who loves competition. Remember, lifetime fighter, 61 years old. I'm still running around and I'll take a match with a
Yeah.
25-year-old black belt. And man, what was the worst that happened? The old man gets his ass kicked. I don't care. But yeah, I've had my ass kicked half my life by my grandfather, so I might as well spend the last half getting it kicked in competition, right? So the idea is like I tell people all the time. In other words, it lets me work all the skill sets I need, like the speed, the timing, and all of that stuff. And I think it's great. But what happens is a lot of times we lose focus. So in other words, what happens is I'll get somebody ready for a Thai boxing match. So I read out no headbutts. I've got to change the clinch. Okay, we've got to go with the Thai approach to the clinch. Oriental rules. Okay, no. Okay, just leg kicks, or I should say just kicks and
Right.
punches. Grappling match. Okay, no punching.
Well,
Okay, and so it's kind of like you're constantly adapting to the rules, and
mhm.
you lighten down what you train.
Right. Well, now that you mention that, how does all this, the biting, the headbutting, the groin strikes, change the dynamics of a fight in close, in a clinch, or on the ground? You
It,
can't fight exactly the same as you would even in an MMA fight, right?
spatial distance
Hmm.
is everything. I try to say the easiest way to figure this out, the easiest way to see it is take grappling. You may have a really sweet half guard,
Hmm.
okay, for grappling. Now, I'm not a big fan of deep half guard. Why? Because when you mix striking in, there's elbows and punches coming on your head. So it's kind of like I don't view that as a practical position, except in transition in a
Hmm.
fight. The same thing starts to go with biting, headbutting. I always said one of the biggest changes in mixed martial arts and handicapped wrestlers was the headbutt.
Hmm.
Okay, because you're in guard, you lose control of the guy's head for a second. He's a big guy that wrestles. Boom, you're eating a head to the face.
Yeah.
So it's kind of like the same thing with like you put striking on the ground. Suddenly, when you start to swivel out to use your guard, and he punches you in the ribs hard. Boom, the movement stops.
Yeah.
So it's the same thing with this. In other words, you have to, if you're monitoring his mouth, suddenly you're not going for that fancy sweep or you're not going for that fancy armbar because like you just lost your ear.
Hmm.
So the idea is like I used to, in other words, and I know you've done this with me. I'll put a mouthpiece in
Yeah.
and gnaw a little bit. Okay, if you bite down on somebody's finger while you're doing an armbar, they'll break their own arm.
And this probably sounds crazy to people who have never trained this way, but if you want to talk about practical defensive moves, I've always felt biting is pound for pound one of the most effective things you can do because it's very easy. The way you showed me is anything that comes near your mouth, you're biting down on it. And it's extremely painful for the person that's suffering it. It may not automatically incapacitate them like a torn MCL in their knee, but for most people, that much pain is going to short circuit their brain, at least for a little while. And again, the fact that it's just so easy to do, you don't have to really be trained for it. You may show somebody shows you how to do it, and you can do
Most
it.
people, you just show them how to do it,
Yeah,
and they train it 3 times a day.
yeah,
3 meals a day, you got plenty
yeah.
of bite practice. But like I try to tell people, the thing is you have to be aware of it and think about it, think spatial relationships.
Hmm.
Because like I always tell people, one of the biggest things, I used to do this in like self-defense seminars. The last, you make me feel threatened for my life. The last thing you have to worry about is me going mixed martial arts on your ass.
Hmm.
Like I will preface this with I'm gonna take 2 thumbs, poke them in your eyes, headbutt you, and bite your nose off. And like I always said, let's say you're out with your brother and 2 of your best friends. I'm in the bar. Your brother steps to me. He's giving me no choice. It's a fight. I punch him with the right hand and drop him. He goes down like he was shot. You're going to jump me. I bite his nose off and spit it at you. You take him to the hospital. You're not jumping me.
Yeah.
Nobody wants to fight with Hannibal Lecter. And a lot of fighting is, are you willing to go as far as I am? And
And
I,
the one caveat to that I would say though is that you're somebody who has actually trained this and used it in competitive circumstances, whereas a lot of people say how effective biting or groin shots are, but either they've never trained it or they've just trained it in a very controlled atmosphere. And
Well, I'll tell you, as weird as it sounds, biting I would react to. If you
Mhm.
bite my nose off, it's going to throw me.
Yeah.
You kick me in the balls, not that much.
Hmm.
I've been kicked in the balls so many times. I don't get that much of a reaction to it anymore. It's like anything else. Like it's my leg. It's my legs. You kick me in the leg. I just kind of I don't hold pads for my students. I let them
And
kick me in the leg.
and I should point out here that I recently did a story with you on just this topic of how to use and defend against foul tactics like this in self-defense for the publication Personal Defense World. I don't think the article has been released yet, but when it is, I'll post a link to it down in the show notes and maybe on my website so people can check back for that if they want to read more about this
You know
topic as it
what's
relates to self-defense.
you know what's scary? I already forgot about that.
Too many headbutts, so.
Exactly.
So nowadays, you primarily train fighters for MMA. You used to call your gym the Asylum Gym. Do you still use that name?
Yeah, it's actually it's the Asylum Fight Team.
Okay, explain a little what
Okay.
that means to you because I always thought it was a fascinating take on this. Jody, when she was on the show recently, talked about the interesting cross section of people you used to have in your gym, from
Well,
aging cops to ex-cons. So, explain a little why you
well,
call it
one
Asylum.
of one of the things is I've always been one of those people who believes that money should not be, because I've always, like, I taught for free in Vegas. I had a school in New Jersey, and I know I was the cheapest school there was. And some people say you get what you pay for, but I was never into martial arts for money. I'm in it because I love it. And for me, the Asylum Fight Team, it kind of started as two things. I always thought a gym. I've never called myself like a school, but a gym should be a safe place
Mhm.
to explore certain aspects of yourself. What pushed it over the edge is, now remember, when I first started, it was in the days of the early UFCs, and everybody was telling you, well, I would just. So I got to the point where I got so tired of hearing from the local, guy that had 6 weeks of Taekwondo. Well, I would just, okay, I'll give you $1,000 if you can beat me up. Now, remember, I don't do this anymore. That was just. And remember, I was young, I was brash, I was like, I was an idiot. Basically, I'm fighting with people, before class some days. So it's kind of like I became, and I also did a couple seminars on biting and eye gouging and introducing it into your sport game. So suddenly I became the crazy guy, and my gym was in the basement. So in the area, in the martial art field, I was kind of like the crazy guy in the basement. And I thought to myself, okay, safe place, crazy guy in a basement. And the third thing was, I've always said, a lot of people get into this because they want to learn to protect themselves. But honestly, they don't stay with it because they want to learn to protect themselves. They stay with it because they start to enjoy it. It starts to become almost like part of them. Like I see people come in with no intention of ever getting in the ring.
Mhm.
Then suddenly after a year, coach, I'll take Jody, for example.
Yeah.
She's coming in because basically, not Jody, I love Jody. She was a friend before she ever came in. And I was devoted to her, maiming that guy. Like I'm talking, I wanted to do it myself.
You're talking
Okay,
about
but
the
she would,
person who had attacked her that
yeah,
originally inspired her to start training with you.
dude, I'm doing stuff like I got her 3 knives, one for her bra, one for her hip, one for her sock. I would stick her in the trunk of my car. And as I opened the trunk of my car, I would have her attack me because I was getting her ready. Because on one hand, she's the sweetest person in the world, but I can picture her sticking a knife in somebody's spine. So it's kind of like
Hey,
you
she
you've
was
got
a
to be
Marine, so
you've got to be a little bit different to do this. In other words,
yeah.
who goes on, like I joke around, we have striking class on Tuesday night. Who wakes up on Tuesday morning and says, "Thank God, it's face punching day"? Somebody who comes to an asylum.
Hmm.
Like you remember when I had the bigger school in Ramsey,
Hmm.
I had the pictures of different insane asylums on the wall. I just I embrace the fact that to participate in a combat martial art, you've got to be a little bit different. And it's not, I always tell people it's facets of the individual. It's one of the reasons, like, and I know this is way off topic, Teddy Roosevelt is one of my favorite people because he really explored the different facets of who you are. You're intellectual, you're emotional, you're physical. You need all of them. Like, and it's one of the things that you did a great program the other day on the females in the mixed martial arts. And I've always hated the fact that society tells them a bill of goods. You're not a woman if you do something with this. Screw that shit. Okay, why can't a woman punch somebody in the face? You know, most people need to get punched in the face to begin with.
Oh, absolutely.
I think a
I
large part of
probably needed it a number of times in my life, even when it wasn't happening.
I
But
think a large part of the problem with our society is not enough face punching.
oh yeah, yeah. There are very few people that at some point in their life would not have benefited from being punched in the face, probably.
Well, I honestly think it's good for everybody because it does several things, and one of which is you realize you're not made of glass.
Hmm.
My favorite used to be I used to do self-defense seminars at Ford for the co-eds.
Hmm.
And the women were so funny. They'd come in and I'd have them work an eye pokes. Every time they made contact with the other girl's forehead, it would be, "Oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry." There is no "I'm fucking sorry" in fighting. Okay? In other words, it's like crying in baseball. You can't do it. By the end of the class, they're murdering each other. That's what I love when you put people in touch with what's inside them.
Yeah.
The guy who comes in thinking, "Oh, I can throw these bad boys." Dude, he punks out after the first class. He gets hit in the face and quits. The guy who comes in and tells you, "Hey, listen, I've never been in a fight. I'm afraid," gets hit. And you look at him and it's like he bites down on his mouthpiece and wants to commit homicide.
Hmm.
Hey, I can work with that.
Yeah. But nowadays, you call your gym a Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu school, even though you're teaching pretty much pure Burmese martial arts. And while on the surface, the grappling looks somewhat similar, there are some subtle
I teach very
differences.
bad BJJ.
Well, I always make fun of you for selling out and trying to cash in on the BJJ name, but you are technically a third-degree black belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. And
Actually, I looked it up. I'm only a second.
oh, only
Sorry.
second. Okay. But you have won the Masters division at the World Championships in BJJ, even though you've never actually formally trained in
Yeah,
BJJ. Explain how.
basically it was a funny thing. I had I think he was a fourth degree at the time. He was working out with me, and I told him I'd like to do the IBJJF and SJJF tournaments, and he knew a lot of people, so he made it so that he got it so that I could do the SJJF, and I won the LA Open, I won this, I won that, I won the other thing, and I registered for the Worlds. Then I get an email in saying that I can't compete at the Worlds. And I'm going back and forth with them, and they said because I'm not a certified black belt. And I'm like, "Dude, do you want me to do the white belt division? I already won the nationals in the black." And they said, "Oh, no, you can't compete as a white belt." So basically, I reached out to them in the IBJJF to find out what I had to do to get certified as a black belt. I needed somebody who was fifth degree and over. And my buddy Tony trained with Ricardo Cavalcante. He's one of Carlson Gracie's original black belts.
Mhm.
And we worked it out. He promoted me to black belt. I represent his school when I compete. I've won the IBJJF Worlds, Masters Worlds in the gi once, and I took silver once. And I've won the SJJF. I've won 9 golds at the SJJF in the black belt division at the Worlds, but 4 of them are in the gi. So my thing is I had never really worn a gi. And some people really got, how do I say this, insulted that I got a black belt in BJJ when I wasn't a gi guy.
Mhm.
So my whole thing is, okay, you want to say I'm not good. You want to say I don't deserve it. Here I am. I'll slap on a gi. I'll show up. Come get it. Like there was one guy who made a public fuss, and it was kind of funny. So I reached out to one of these pro fight shows, and he had been looking for a match there. So when I reached out, I said, give me a match with him. I'll take it. They came back to me with, "Oh, he'll only do gi." And I came back and I said, "Do me a favor, send this to him." I came back with, "I don't care whether it's gi, no gi, friggin' naked." I'm going to submit and humiliate him in front of his friends and family and shut him up. Okay, he wouldn't take the match because I'm one of those people. Hey, look, I don't care what you are. It's all friggin' grappling. I'm so I'm so sick of somebody saying judo sucks, BJJ sucks, this sucks, this is better than that. No, what's best is the thing you train in. What's best is what's best for you. And I've actually come to the conclusion in martial arts, in all martial arts. Now this is kind of like taking the Bruce Lee thing and extrapolating it a little bit, but not really to the ingenious way he did it. This is the Phil dumbed down version. Let's say we call it I do Burmese jiu-jitsu. But in reality, my Naban has become influenced by jiu-jitsu, sambo, wrestling, everything I've had to compete against. Mm-hmm. When I went to Thailand and competed in Thai boxing, when I did a couple Sandow matches in China, when I went Oriental rules in Japan, I had to adjust to what they did. I was influenced by that. So it changed. I always go back to my combat principles of Burmese martial arts with everything I look at. Does it make sense? Like deep half guard. I will not use deep half guard even in grappling. Why? It does not make sense to me because it's going to get me punched in the face. Mm-hmm. I can't understand a video series, a 7-tape series on De La Hiva guard. Because to me, it's
on what guard? What guard was that?
De La Hiva.
Oh, okay.
Okay, because to me, it's like a transitional position because you should be going, in my book, you should be going for leg locks from there.
Yeah.
Not for these advanced sweeps, these fancy moves and stuff like that. So a lot of what people, even take a look at BJJ, you go from school to school to school. Some schools are completely different than others.
Yeah.
It's almost like they're doing a different system. So my point is, I don't care whether you call it Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, left way, Thai boxing, it actually ends up, I do Phil Jitsu. If I'm teaching you, let me ask you a question. You've trained with me quite a bit. Mm-hmm. Do you think you grapple like me or a little bit like me, a little bit like some of your other teachers?
Oh, yeah, certainly. You definitely had a big influence on me because you had a much more systematic way of looking at this than a lot of the other instructors I had trained with. So just from that aspect, you really influenced me. But I've definitely taken pieces from, good example of this is the straight Achilles lock. Now, I originally learned that in shoot fighting, and then I trained with Gene LaBelle a bit, and he showed me how to really get the bone of the inside of the forearm against that Achilles. And then I trained with a great Sambo champion named David Rudman, and he showed me a progression, how to get it locked in, how to use your elbow to get it very tight against your body so there's no wiggle room. And then I trained with you, and you showed me how you go off on an angle, kind of lean your shoulder down towards your hip to put an odd sort of torque on the Achilles. Yeah, and if I combine all of those, I found use from all those instructors, and I've added them all in, and I think it made it as effective as it can be at this point by just taking the best of.
You're doing what works for you.
Yeah.
Okay, so in other words, my hope for you is that you do Mark Jitsu. Mm-hmm. I don't want, you train with me full time for the next 10 years. I don't want a mini me. Mm-hmm. Your body structure is different. Your personality is different. It's kind of like you're not afraid of biting somebody's nose off. You're afraid of getting snot in your mouth. Oh, by the way, Mark happens to be a germaphobe. Nobody knows.
That is true. I never minded the biting. I just always wanted you to put some antibacterial stuff on your arm before I bit down on it.
Yeah. Okay. So in other words, once again, back to the asylum. We're all a little bit crazy. The guy's grappling and biting with me, and he wants me to wear disinfectant.
So you're still occasionally competing on the pro grappling circuit. You're 61, but you still.
The last year I've had some health issues. So this year I've only competed. I did the IBJF Washington Open. Mm-hmm. I won 4 golds at that. And then I did 2 pro shows.
And you go out there and compete against these guys in their 20s and 30s, right?
Well, normally if I do the IBJJF, I'll pick the master's class closest to where I get a match. So like for the sake of argument, I have guys fighting in Utah when Nogi Worlds is this year. But if they weren't fighting, I'd have gone out and competed at the Nogi Worlds, and I'd have gone, Master 7, which is my legit division,
Right.
16 over.
But when you do the
Okay.
pro grappling, you're just whoever they're matching
One
you
of
up
my one of
against.
my opponents was 30
Right.
for that last pro show.
Now, why are you doing
Before that, I
this?
had last year I had a fight in July, or match in July. I always call grappling matches, not fights, because I'm not getting it in the face, against a UFC fighter who was 26. And it's kind of like, I do it because, well, first of all, I love to compete. It helps me stay relevant. And the fact that I'm doing it is testament to technique. Dude, I'm older than 30. I'm 61 years old. And it's kind of like, if I can compensate for their speed, like the match against the 30-year-old, I won.
Mm-hmm.
So if I can compensate for their speed and athletic attributes, it shows how valuable technique is. The other thing is it keeps me fresh. It keeps me relevant. And I'm not grappling to beat Gordon Ryan. My days as like the man, if they ever were, they're over. Like as a striker, I consider myself the man. As a grappler, I've been a solid grappler, kind of like a hack plus in my mind. But like I always joke around. In other words, I'm training for the guy who jumps me in the street. If you can't outstrike, out grapple me. When I start biting or use a knife, you're foobarred.
Mm-hmm.
To me, it's always about getting back to, like, if I was in a fight, the last thing that's going to happen is me taking you down.
Mm-hmm.
And then if you take me down, and let's say I lock a picture perfect triangle on you, I'm going to punch you until you're unconscious. That choke is just to hold you in the punch so you can't get out.
Mm-hmm.
When it comes to fighting, I'm by nature to be kind to my opponent. I'm going to render him physically incapable of doing any further damage.
Mm-hmm.
And for me, I compete to keep myself sharp. I compete because, like, somebody I was talking to, a 40-year-old at an event. I was just coaching, and he goes, "What do you?" And it was actually. No, I was actually competing. It was at the IBJJF tournament, and he's 40 years old. He's kind of somebody in the BJJ community. He hasn't competed in about 8 years, and he said, "Why are you competing? What are you trying to prove?" And I looked at him and I go, "You're asking the wrong question." And he goes, "What do you mean?" I said, "Dude, do you love BJJ? Do you love grappling?" He goes, "Yeah." "Why aren't you competing?" And then he came up with 4 or 5 reasons.
Mm-hmm.
One of which was he didn't want to lose.
Mm-hmm. Well,
I don't care about that.
One thing I always appreciate about you is the lack of ego. I don't know many masters, I'll use quotation marks on that, who are willing to go out and risk basically getting their asses kicked by some young guy in front of all their students. But you have no problem with that. You just like to compete and you don't worry about what people will think of you.
Okay, first of all, people are going to think what they think anyway. I've got no control. And between you and I care about the people I care about.
Mm-hmm.
My guys, I lead from the front. I make no bones about that.
Mm-hmm.
If the fact that I lost is going to lose me students, I don't want those students.
Mm-hmm.
I'm one of those people that, to me, it's all about that idea that, hey, this is about being the best you can be, and competition keeps me sharp.
Yeah,
And in the gym, I'm working out with 20-year-olds every day.
Yeah, to me, that's a very admirable attitude to have, but you see it from very few older, well-known martial artists, it seems.
It comes back down to put a bunch of guys in the room. They're martial artists. I was at an open mat someplace way in the early days of mixed martial arts, and it was kind of funny because I took 2 of my students. You know them both, Keith and Pat.
Mm-hmm.
I ended up rolling with Keith and Pat. Keith rolled with a couple guys. Pat rolled with one guy. Once they saw him roll, they didn't want to roll with him anymore. Nobody else did.
And Pat was a big boy. People should know that. Pat was a power lifter and
No.
very.
I actually had a couple giant nose tackles come to the gym and train with us. Pat, like, manhandled them physically.
Mm-hmm.
And it's kind of like, Pat was just a monster. But what was funny is Pat goes, he looks at me and he goes, "Why won't anybody roll with you?" And I said, "Yeah, it's kind of like, at first I was wondering, did I forget my deodorant?" I'm like sniffing my armpits. Do I smell that bad? There can only be one man. I was the only guy there that was that was decent, that was willing to risk losing.
Mhm.
All the other quote unquote instructors there were kind of like, they were talking, they weren't rolling.
Yeah.
I didn't know why we were there if we weren't rolling. So I rolled with everybody that wanted to roll. It's the way I am.
Yeah.
Gordon Ryan comes by my school. This motherfucker not getting out of that room without kicking my ass for all my students to see. Well, I think Gordon Ryan is the best no-gi grappler there is right now. You call me up, you say, Phil, 3 weeks from now, I got a match from you with Gordon Ryan. We're going to answer a question. How fast can Gordon Ryan kick my ass? But he's going to have to kick my ass. That's what I'm saying, is I don't understand the purpose of this whole thing without that.
Yeah.
I can understand, like, in other words, yeah, I need shoulder replacement. I need knee reconstruction. I broke my neck at 29. I've had cancer. I've had this. I've had that. I've had the other thing. But I don't understand. Like, for me, training and competing are just natural.
Well,
Naturally go
you've had
together.
all those issues. Well, what is your key to maintaining your physical longevity where still at your age you can go out and compete with guys that young?
I honestly credit a lot of it with my diet.
Hmm.
I'm a lifelong vegan. Now, I will tell you, early in my career, I really handcuffed myself because I was primarily a fruit-based vegan. I never fought higher than 170 pounds. I could never break 170 pounds. At 19, I fought at 147. Then at 21, I had managed to get up to 163, so I fought at 163. Then at 24, I moved into the open weight division, which was 170 and over. So I never fought heavier. Even when I came back and did mixed martial arts, I was never heavier than 170. Then when I was about 42, I managed to lift my way up to about 180. And then it was kind of like I always was a fruit-based vegetarian, ate mostly fruit. Then I got cancer, went through the treatment for cancer. And when I came back, I had to take 3 years off at one point. And I was like a 191-pound puffy water balloon. I started to get myself back in shape, but I had to change my diet because it's damage to my pancreas. And I started to eat a nut-based diet. And I will tell you that change in my diet, I started to pack on muscle like crazy. I started to take a vegan protein supplement and eat a lot of nuts. Like, I eat 2-3 pounds of cashews a day, 2-3 pounds of walnuts, if not cashews. So the idea is I'm getting a lot of calories now and a lot of protein. And my body is just like, I'm talking, my dad was a big guy. I had never realized how I was holding myself back, because right now I'm about 215, but at one point I managed to bulk up to 230, but it was just too muscular.
Yeah.
But it's one of those things that I credit it with both active recovery, stretching, yogic type exercises,
Yeah.
and taking care of myself. I just never stop.
And finally, what do you have coming up either for you or your students, and how can people find out what's going
Well,
on with you, contact you?
I'm not really right now. I'm finishing up some treatments, which finish up at the end of December, and then I plan on trying to make a run next year and having some fun out there. But in the meantime, I have a couple guys fighting in New York on the 24th on Long Island, and then 2 guys fighting in Utah on the 14th in December.
Well, I wish you luck with that. How can people get in touch with you, come train with
I'm
you? What's the best
I'm
way for them
on
to do that?
I'm on Facebook, both Phil Dunlap. You'll see a picture of me in my profile pic. I did Chael Sonnen Submission Underground, and he was interviewing me, so I posted that as my profile pic. And my school name it's www.lexingtonbjj.com, because it's easy to find, but it's the Asylum Fight Team, White Rhino, BJJ, and Mixed Martial Arts.
And we will put a link to that down in the show notes. Phil, I really want to thank you for doing this. It's always a pleasure to talk to you.
I had a great time. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you. Okay, thanks again to Phil for coming on the show. You can find a link to his site down below. You can also find a link to the site for Eleanor Academia, who provides the music to the show down there, as well as a link to my own website. Thank you for listening. Until next time, keep keep punching.